So the title of the talk obviously is Funding 2020. Hopefully the pun works pretty well. I want to thank our art team. Actually, I love this piece of art. So it's nice to be able to use our own art and instead of having to steal others. Most of this talk is going to be focused on funding, both from the investor and developer side, and a lot of data, along with some rather interesting, if albeit personal insights. So hopefully it'll be interesting for folks. I'll start with first, I was cool once. For those of you, most of you are probably too young to recognize the folks in this, but the first one on the far left is Chuck D from Public Enemy. And then the center one is actually Ice-T. And then to the right is a platinum album I got for being one of the first DJs on the West Coast to play Naughty by Nature's OPP. So 30 plus, this actually almost exactly 30 years ago, I was cool. And that probably was the only time in my life I was cool. So we talk about eclectic backgrounds in the industry. This was about as close to art as I ever got, which was being a DJ. The alternate title for this talk, and something that I was actually going to do probably at Reboot, was Cream, which is Cash Rules Everything Around Me. This song came out the first year I started in the industry, which was 1993. That won't seem that long ago to Larry and a few other folks, but for most folks, this is for most folks, this will seem like a lifetime ago, including some of the people in my office where I actually started my career in the industry before they were born. So it's fun. Yes, I'm old, and that's okay. So let's quick overview of the topics I'm hoping to go through by the numbers. Again, I said a lot of data. Next one will be kind of how funding works. I've found that a lot of people, when they're pitching, developers are pitching investors or VCs or publishers, they don't really understand how they actually work and what each set is kind of looking for. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And again, I'm happy to answer more questions later. I'll give kind of a 10,000 foot, not quite 20,000 foot view. I'll talk about Xsolla's Funding Club and what we're doing there. I generally try not to talk about my own company too much in a talk, but since I'll be sharing a ton of data, most of that is from the Funding Club. I'll talk from the point of view of investors, what they're looking for in some data, talk about developers, what we're seeing being submitted in some data. I'll talk about why we started Funding Club and what we're trying to do with it. And then I'll pull out my crystal ball and make some not too far out projections on what's happening now based on all the fun going on around us and what's going to happen in the near future. You know, I don't think the first set of slides are going to come as much as a surprise to anybody. 2019, games generated more revenue than movies and music combined. I actually used to hate this statistic because most of the time it did not include home video and other things, because movies have so many other ways to make money than just theatrical. These numbers actually do. So it is truly bigger than Hollywood and music, including the ancillary revenue streams. Maybe not necessarily licensing and merchandise, but all box office. Let's take a look at 2020, because I think this is even more interesting. This forecast came out fairly recently, even though we're all having fun with COVID. The projection is still for the industry to be up 9.3% year over year. So it's going to supposedly hit 159.3 billion. You can see in the colors, console 45 plus billion, so up almost 7% year over year. And then you can see PC is up 4% year over year. And then you move into mobile, which is obviously the biggest chunk, includes smartphone and tablet, which is huge and growing. So again, the news, with everything going on, the news is actually still good for our industry, thank goodness. We're probably lucky in one of the only industries that's not absolutely going to be decimated, at least yet. Let's look a little farther forward, though. Like I said, I love my numbers. And again, nobody really knows the accuracy of any of this. But if you take a look at this forecast, it shows the numbers from 2019. Between 145 and 151 are the numbers I've seen, projecting 2020 at 159. And you see by 2023, over 200 billion with a compounded growth rate of 8.3, which I believe is going to outpace every other industry they projected, except for maybe industries that are just starting in growth, like esports and streaming. Those, because the numbers started so small, may grow faster, but much more inconsistently. This is a slide I like to throw out and laugh at. They're saying could be 300 billion by 2025. I would love that to happen. I doubt very much it will. I'm guessing between 225 and 250. Still nothing to laugh at. I think the real thing to look at is the growth for each of those. So blue is 2018, gray is 2021, and the red or fuchsia is 2025. And you can see the projections for almost everything except for casual web games is increasing pretty dramatically. Even handheld, which may come as a shock, but I think it depends on whether or not you count the Switch as a handheld or a console or both. And then again, smartphone outpacing everything significantly. We all knew that, but that market is brutal unless you're the land of the rich. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why myself and Xsolla is really bullish on the numbers. And this is something that anybody who's been in the industry a long time should be really thankful for. And that is the number of women and girl gamers in society and how acceptable it is now. It has increased dramatically over the last decade or so, to the point where they're identifying themselves as gamers or game players. And just for reference, those numbers, when you see this like 75% for mobile gaming for males, that's 75% of the entire US population in that age group. So
Justin, I'm sorry to interrupt. We have a request. Can you hit the hide button on sharing your screen message?
So sorry. There you go. How's that? Thank you. So what this is telling us is that the future for our industry looks really, really good as well, because the 13 to 17-year-old demographic are the ones that end up being the ones spending the most money as they age up into that sweet spot for traditional gamers of the 18 to 34-year-olds. So my gut reaction on when I see this slide is we're in for a pretty good ride upwards as we become more socially acceptable, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. A couple of things in this that really surprised me, and I think maybe surprised some folks that don't pay a lot of attention to the numbers, is that almost 50% of girls or 13 to 17 identifies themselves as playing PC games, and over 50% are playing console games. In the past, when I saw these numbers even 10 years ago, it was sub 25% for those two categories. So that also bodes really well for the future of our industry, and is one of the reasons I love being in this business. Plus, I'm a game geek, but that's the point. So let's talk a little bit about the investment side of things. And you know, unfortunately, I won't have numbers for 2019 yet, but I'll give you some data on 2018. Digital game revenue leapt 11% in 2018. Premium game revenue rose 10%. So while they're talking about all the stuff moving to free to play and mobile, premium games, you know, games that you pay for up front, still rose 10% in 2018. And for me, who is a linear story driven fanatic, it is a great sign, because those games do not work well in a free to play environment. In 2018, investors spent $5.7 billion directly on game developers, not on tech or other things, but actually in game development. And that is twice what they invested in 2017. So we don't have numbers for 2019 yet. I'd be shocked if they actually doubled from 2018, but I believe they will still be up higher. So there is still a lot of money from investors going to game developers and in games. And that's another thing that excites me, because that means more really cool games coming out and more unique experiences. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about this slide that actually took me a long time to figure out, and it's something I didn't really learn until I spent more time on the actual investor side. So it's VC versus equity versus project finance. And what that really means, VCs, so venture capitalists, they want an exit. And what I mean by they want an exit, they're looking for growth businesses. They're looking for a minimum of 3 to 5x, but most you talk to are minimums of 20 to 100x. So they're looking for a return on their investments. They're basically looking for unicorns. I'm going to ask, and I kind of throw this out there, how many big game company exits can you think of happen a year where somebody's going to get those kind of returns? You know, when I ask this in a live audience, I get maybe a few hands raised. There's maybe a handful of companies every year in the industry that exit. And I can tell you, very rarely are they a developer working on a single game, unless they're a rather large developer who is already well funded. So let's talk a little bit about equity. And yes, VCs buy equity, but there's also equity-based investment. It's slightly different than a pure VC. They're looking for usually roles on the management team. They're looking for a long-term return on investment and long-term growth. They don't mind an exit, but they also realize that exits are frequent and fewer and far between. And project financing, which is what most developers end up pitching for, and which is usually what's available in our industry, is invest in a single game or IP, and they want a fairly rapid return on their investment. So the two above are generally 5 to 10 year return on investments or more. Of course, they would always like it to be sooner. Project financing, they want to start seeing a return on their investment generally 2 to 3 years, which is why it's usually the place for games. And that's where most folks investing in games invest. Sometimes there are hybrid deals. There's a lot of deals that are equity plus project finance, especially from a startup developer that may have, a pedigree of a bunch of people that have spun out of Epic and spun out of Blizzard to form a new team, and they've got that cachet and they're building something big. Somebody will help finance that project, and in exchange, they will also take a small piece of equity as well as financing the project. But it is important to understand when you're getting ready to go pitch somebody what they're looking for, and you tailor your pitch to that. Because if you're just pitching a single project to a VC that's just a single game, you're probably not going to get a lot of traction, and that is why. So this is why the shotgun approach to looking for money for your game doesn't work very well. So I'm going to spend a little bit more time on this. This slide's really funny because it was built in the Nordics. So Tyne is the blue, Oscar is the red. They're basically the co-founders, in this case, you can say, of a game company. Although I don't know any game companies that raise this kind of money. They start out the company. They both have 50%, and so we call that pre-funding. Usually, that's friends and family as well as they'll help fund it and get it started themselves. The next piece is a $1 million investment from an angel investor. And the two owners now have to take a reduced piece of equity in exchange for the money and giving up some equity. I will say that I have yet to see somebody in our industry get $1 million from an angel and only have to give up 15 or 16%. It's normally going to be significantly higher than that, unless you're bringing some real value to the table or you've already got a studio well established and are making money. And then these progress. Seed, so somebody comes in at 2 million. The interesting thing is because their money is in later, even though they're putting in more money, they actually don't get as much equity as the angel who put in less money. And that's because first in usually has priority position. And then it flows Series A, Series B. But the big thing to notice is how everybody's equity is actually diminished. The percentage equity is diminished over time, but the value or the capitalization of the company has gone up significantly. So hopefully when there's an exit, that percentage, even though it's gone down, is still worth significantly more. And then there's usually an option pool left to bring on new people and talent, et cetera. And usually the founders and the other investors sometimes have to liquidate a little bit more so that they can bring on other key hires. And again, this is just a oversimplified example of what happens when you're trying to raise significant amount of money. So if you're trying to build a large scale $25 million, $50 million project, somehow you manage to get started, this is what it would look like a lot more than a simple project-based financing. Let's talk about Xsolla Funding Club. This is where a lot of this data is hopefully going to be interesting. And this is I think a microcosm of the entire industry. What is it? It's a matchmaking service that connects developers and investors so they can receive funds to finish, launch, and market their game. What does that really mean? It means that we soft launched in early 2019 at PAX. We made a kind of a short announcement and talked about what we were trying to build. We moved to a beta phase at Gamescom last year. Right after Gamescom, we had 28 investors in the club. We now have 50. So we've had a 80% increase in investors since May. I'll get into the reasons for this a little later, but I want to just provide a quick summary of kind of what the club is and fundamentally and why we built it. And then we'll get into a little bit more. So one of the things I want to say, actually, I'll go back to that slide. So to be clear, as part of the club, Xsolla does not make investment recommendations. We only screen for accuracy to make sure the builds work, the decks match, and that the content is what it says it is. Investors decide to invest on their own, or they can pool their resources. So it's super important to delineate that while we are able to screen, we do not make investment decisions or recommendations. All right, so on to this. What are most investors that we talk to, including publishers, looking for? And quickly, let me go back. So that number of 50 total investors is 35 investors and 15 publishers. We started with investors first because we didn't want to overweight the fund with too many publishers. But now that we've scaled and have enough investors, we have started onboarding a number of publishers, specifically some of the mid-sized publishers that are really interested in indie games. Going back, so what do most publishers want to see when they're and investors want to see? First and foremost, as always, is a playable build of the game. That could be a prototype, vertical slice, first playable. I don't know what you want to call it, but they want to see it. They want to take it for a test drive. Just like you probably wouldn't buy a new car without taking it for a test drive, especially a car that's never been built before. Most investors and publishers won't want to invest in your game if they can't take it for a test drive. Angel financing for projects is really difficult to come by. The next thing they want is a gameplay video. I generally recommend a 1-minute video. You can provide longer, or maybe you provide 2 separate videos. The video should show me something I won't normally see in the build I play, or it should show something that I might not get to see in the build that leaves me wanting more, teases me, gives me a reason to call you and go, hey, I saw this in the video. I didn't see it in the build. How do I find this? If you can get me that engaged, you're one step closer to getting my money. Next piece is a pitch deck. And the reason I'm putting these in order, this is the order of importance when you're pitching the game: the build, the video, and the deck. The deck is super important as a backup, but if I'm not interested in the game, I don't care about the deck. So in the deck, and again, this is no particular order, I'm not going to tell you what to pitch or necessarily how to pitch, but I'm going to tell you what needs to be in every pitch to give yourself an opportunity and to answer the core questions I'm going to have to make me consider you legitimate and believe that you know what you're doing. So key details, elevator pitch, financial info, budget, timeline, your inspiration. And your inspiration could be different than a comparable title. If I'm really big into kind of 3D RPGs, I can say my inspiration is Zelda, but I'm not going to compare my game to Zelda. I don't have that kind of money or budget. So you can pick 2 separate. Just make sure that you're realistic when you're setting your comparable titles, and your inspirations can always be aspirational. One of the things I am shocked the number of pitches that I see do not include how much money the developer has already spent on the game. If you don't give yourself credit, nobody else will. And when you get to the point of negotiating a deal, you will get a better deal if you can show how much money you've put into the game to get it to where it is. So please don't forget that. Visual target samples. I know talked to a lot of developers that are hesitant to send in early builds to investors or publishers because they don't look great. There may be things wrong with them, etc. I can tell you that most of the folks in this industry screening those games and looking at them for publishers and investors are used to early builds. One of the things we can't do, though, is get inside your head. So we don't understand what you want us to see or feel. So you need to make sure your deck does a good job with that. And what I always say is include in the deck visual targets, especially if I can see an arted up sample of the level I'm playing and what you think it's going to look like when it's done. Because then when I'm playing the build, I can look at that sample and put myself in that world. And it's much easier to understand your vision. If I'm playing an early gray box build of something and I don't have any art to look at, it's still really hard to imagine what the game's going to be. So do your best to include visual target samples. And then this is something else. I generally ask for reasons to believe you're the ones to build this, reason to believe consumers are going to care, and you need something unique or different that's going to differentiate your game and reduce my perceived risk. So those are some of the key things. There's obviously a lot more, and I'm going to remind most devs who haven't done this before, building a really good pitch deck is a little bit about like building an early game. You get it in front of friends or people are going to be honest with you, give you good feedback. You take that feedback, and the true art is figuring out what feedback to take to improve it and which to throw out, just like taking feedback for a game. So let's talk a little bit about platform preferences for investors. And again, this is from the 50 investors that are participating in the funding club. This is not a much wider sample, so there may be some disparity. You'll see that it's interesting that 42% of the folks in the club are actually interested in PC and console. And when I say PC and console, that's PC and console only. They're not looking for any other platforms when they're being pitched. 42% are looking for all, and I want to be careful when I say this. They're looking for all, meaning they will look at everything on all platforms. They generally will not invest in something that is on all platforms immediately. And most investors don't. They will start with a core platform and maybe look to expand to other platforms. But that means they're telling us they want to see everything. You have mobile field there. And by the way, all does include VR and some alternative stuff as well. It's not just PC and console, which is why that's separated. We have mobile. So right now, the people in Funding Club, they said they're only looking for mobile is 6%. So that's 3. And that should give you an idea, because mobile has become the land of the rich. And it's super hard to compete, and it's super hard for a base investor to know what their absolute commitment is going to be on a mobile game, because getting the game built is less than 50% of the cost for the first year after it launches. So the number of people looking for pure mobile is not as high in our club, and that's generally the way it is for investors, with the caveat being if you've had successful mobile titles in the past or have really good KPIs, then more people are going to be interested.
So 2 quick questions on that, Justin. One is, I've always said that that PC and console have a higher degree of predictability than mobile. Would you agree with that, or do you think the investors agree with that?
I would think anybody who's looked at the numbers would agree with that. Now, again, it's my crystal ball, as I joke at the end, is not great, or I'd be retired living on an island making games. Right. But I just think that the lack of predictability in the mobile market, because you never know how much you're going to have to spend on user acquisition in your competition, is actually made it definitely less predictable. So that's why I think you're seeing that most of these investors and publishers, and plus, let's just be honest, it's easier to know. You kind of have a relatively decent idea when you invest in a PC or console game what the total budget of the game is, approximate marketing spend, QA, localization, ratings, and even some post-launch stuff. In mobile, you have no idea what your total cost is going to be for the game. Even if it starts out as a couple $1 million development, you could end up putting 20, 30 million in before you start seeing any real ROI. And that's if the game is successful.
And that's because of acquisition costs, right? That's the
acquisition costs and the distribution, trying to get distribution in some of the territories. And it's just way more volatile and unpredictable than the PC console market. Now, somebody much smarter than me may figure this out, and I think some of the big companies in mobile do, because they have big networks and they can push customers around. So those people can afford to buy into games, and they have their own numbers, and they know how much it's going to cost to transition one of their users to somebody else. But there's not a lot of those companies out there, so it's pretty difficult to predict, and I think that is why you see less. Now, we have seen more and more companies coming to us wanting to participate, and I think we're going to have more of that because of what's going on now, and people can't travel the globe and meet developers. So we're having more investors coming to us and trying to find a marketplace for content, which is why I think the timing is actually really good for this and is really good for the talk. But that's, so you're absolutely right. It's just predictability. And one of the things investors and publishers like is they want easy. They want predictability. They want to protect themselves as much as humanly possible.
Right. Okay. You answered both of my questions. That was great. Thank you.
Perfect. And again, I'm happy to go over any of this later. I'm trying not to go down too many rabbit holes, but if anybody's got more detailed questions, or if anybody just wants to interrupt and have Larry or whatever else ask a question, please feel free. So we'll get on to the developer side, and this is one of my favorite slides. I've talked about this for years, and I finally was able to find a meme and put it together. Developers at the beginning of the project, we all think we're magic, and we're all full of hope and wonder. Developers at the end of the project, a little bit of suicidal tendencies, along with wanting to shoot anybody that crosses our path. And then I always joke about this: the developers at the GDC postmortem, talking about how great I was, look at everything I did right. I didn't do anything wrong. And this, by the way, this goes for investors as well. We do the same thing. We start out bright-eyed and bushy-tail. When we make these investments, we're not starting to see returns. We panic. And then as soon as one is successful, we go on to this talk show circuit and go, hey, look at how great we are. We're so smart. We made this great investment. So the industry is the same. I could literally put this for investors as well. But this is my transition to to what we're seeing from the developer side. And I will end this slide with the struggle is real. Okay, so developers, what are we seeing in Funding Club? To date, the game submissions we've seen is 322. This next piece of data may shock you or it may not if you've been in the industry for a while. The games matched with investors to date are 78. So 24% of the games that have been submitted so far have actually found matches with investors. Now, I want to caution you that found a match with investor does not mean received investment or funded. It just means that there was a match with investors, the game, the platform, the genres, the budget matched with what the investors said they were looking for. And so they were paired up. It is the responsibility of the investor to then reach out to the developers and their pitch. And this is where we step out of it and leave them to their own devices. So I'm going to talk this a little bit because this will help explain top reasons for a match not being found. Number one is an incomplete application. There's a few bugs, so sometimes it's our fault. Most of the time, the developer starts an application and either doesn't have everything they need or submits it and forgot something, and we have to go back to them. And it doesn't mean they can't resubmit, but there's missing pieces. So that's the top reason. And of course, we do get some spam applications, but those aren't counted in the submissions to date. We just delete those. One of the other top reasons, the build they send us does not work properly or function properly. And even after our team goes back and asks, we still cannot get a build up and running properly. We obviously can't send this to an investor with a build that doesn't work. So that's another reason for no match. The pitch deck, the vision does not align with capabilities or with the build that we're being sent. And the example I'll throw out is the pitch deck that asked for 25 million for a game from a studio that was 3 people in Latin America. So sometimes we just reject them because no investor wants to see that. And at the end of this slide, I'll talk about a little bit about why investors like what we're doing. And I'll quick anecdote. So the current status is too early to show investors, maximize investment potential, and I'll say minimize risk. So either the pitch deck is too early and not fleshed out, or doesn't have all the information, or the build is just, even though it works, is so poor, it doesn't show the promise. And there's really nothing there for the folks to play or to be able to do anything with. And then the last one is no unique selling point. We do get a lot of these. We get a lot of applications that are pretty much just copycats of existing games that are already out there. We even had a deck that obviously stole somebody else's artwork. And if we catch that, that's obviously a big no-no. Some stuff could slip through, but that's another reason. So quickly, one of the real pieces, and I go back to this, we can't make investment decisions, but we can screen, is the value for investors that we don't send them everything. Most investors I talk to, including when I was one at 505 and I was doing all this, my biggest problem was too many games that I wasn't interested in meant that I couldn't focus on the games that I was. I will use this example, and I feel sorry for my friends at DDM, but I will call out names. This was a long time ago. We dealt with DDM, and for those who don't know, they're one of the largest agencies in our industry. And they hired a new guy to do BD for them. And he basically started sending me every single game and every single developer they had working for them. So I'd get anywhere between 5 and 20 pitches a week. The problem with that is, of those up to 20 pitches, there maybe be one that actually fit what they knew our criteria was. So after about 3 weeks of this, I had to send a note to them basically saying I'm going to blacklist them if they don't start filtering and only send me the stuff they think I'm actually interested in. So I kind of took that to heart, and I'm like, if I can't provide that value to investors, then why would an investor join? So one of the things we are doing is setting up a pretty strict screening process so investors are not bombarded with stuff that they're not interested in. The good news is that means the stuff they're sent, they're going to pay a lot more attention to. And we find that the open rates when we send them the batches is almost 100%, meaning that when we send them a batch of games that we do every 4 to 6 weeks, almost every investor opens that and almost right away, which is probably why we're actually now at 50 investors. And I can go into this later in the Q&A if folks want, but there's a lot of other subtle reasons why the games don't match. Primary release platforms. So again, this is just the data that we're seeing of that 300 plus submissions. And this shouldn't really come as much as a surprise because most of the submissions we're getting are from independent developers. PC is generally the primary platform, with the distribution for Switch, PlayStation 4, and Xbox One almost being identical and even across the board. Now, when we first started this, the number, this was a little over a year ago, the number for Switch was about 5%. So that's obviously increased dramatically because of the success of the Switch. And then you can see mobile is about 10%. Next gen consoles, so we're talking about games that are not being built for current gen but only for next gen, is almost 6%. Browser based 3.2, and other is like VR and random weird one-offs. So that's the mix that we're seeing currently being submitted. I'm obviously going to guess that the percentage for next gen only is going to go up over the next year. And some of those other percentages will change. It'll be interesting to track the PC percentage over time. I do not think that's going to change very much because that seems to be the core development platform for most indie developers. So game genres. This is one that I thought was, particularly as a geek like me, was interesting. So action and adventure combined are over 60% of the total submissions we get. So of the 300 plus, that means over almost 200 have been in the action adventure category. Like almost 17% are role playing, 8.5% are strategy, 7.5% are simulation, and then sports are relatively small. And I figure most people can guess why. Sports are super expensive games to build, and generally not the land of independent developers unless they're doing something that's sports related but not related to a league or something licensed. So that's where that makes sense. Monetization type, and again, this shouldn't really surprise most folks either, given we don't have a lot of mobile games coming in currently. Premium, so buy to play, is 60+%. In-game microtransactions, which generally means free to play, is 27%. In-game ads and offers is 6.8%, and then the subscription 4.8%. Now there are some that do crossover and do multiple of those, including some of the in-game microtransactions also will offer ads and stuff. And we are seeing a rise in subscriptions for games that are not free to play as well. So estimated developer budgets, and I tried to do this slide and the next slide on the same slide, and it was too busy. So I'm going to go back and forth a bit because I think you'll find it interesting. So these are the budgets that we're seeing being submitted to Xsolla Funding Club currently right now. So sub 100,000 is only 3%. And that kind of makes sense because the developers submitting to Funding Club, we have not done a lot of advertising or marketing. It's mostly been word of mouth and by us attending events or trade shows. So generally, you find those developers are usually a little more savvy and higher, have a little bit higher of experience. So they're not going to be as cheap and they're not fundamentally startups. So that's why that number's so low. 100 to 200,000 is about 12%. And then you get into these other numbers. The interesting thing are the numbers of the 1 to 3 million. This was kind of surprising to me. I actually expected the number to be higher for the other tiers. Is it pretty? But again, it goes back to what we're sourcing and where we're getting, and a lot of it's referrals and word of mouth. So it's a slightly more sophisticated than a developer just coming out of school and starting a game. Next biggest at 27% is the 200 to 500K, 15% 500 to a mil, and about 12% greater than 3 million. And so the interesting thing for me there is that the number of games over 3 million is the same as the number of games at 100 to 200,000. This is where it'll get really interesting. Our team managed to pull some data from Steam, and I'm going to kind of read you this caveat so folks know. The data is roughly 30% of all the games published on Steam for the last 3 years, and the 3.5 years, that literally goes from mid 2015 to mid 2019. So the pie chart represents roughly 8,500 games out of 28,000 games published on Steam during that period. So we were able to pull estimated budgets for roughly 30% of all the games for 3.5 years on Steam. And these are the numbers we got. And at first it surprised me quite a bit, which is why I'll go back and forth in a minute. The number of games on Steam that are 0 to 100,000 was 67%. And again, I can't say that this data is without a large margin of error because it was only 30%, but you can extrapolate that it's probably relatively similar across the board. If you go back to the other slide, again, only 3% of the games that we've seen in Funding Club are in that budget range. And this surprised me because this slide here, the Steam one, we built and worked on about 6 months to a year ago. So I saw this data first. So when I saw our data, it kind of took me by surprise how much larger of a percentage on Steam was 0 to 100. But then I stepped back and thought about how almost anybody can release a game on Steam, and so you have the single person all the way up to 2 or 3, spending almost no money shoving something out. So the data is definitely skewed because of that. But this gives you an idea of what's competing on Steam, but it should also give you an idea if you can. I don't have the data, but I've seen it on the games that sell better, and generally get higher budget games that are actually slightly higher price points actually do better on Steam, not just in terms of units or dollars, but actually in units as well, because the perceived value of those games is higher. So that is something for folks to keep in mind when they're thinking about pricing their game, that don't think that I have to price it low to sell more units. Oftentimes that's counterintuitive, but can work against you, especially if you're building something that's actually quality. You need to make sure you benchmark it against other games that are similar, of similar length, style, and quality, and make sure that you're not thinking that you should price it lower to compete on price. It doesn't end well. So we'll go into these other categories real quickly. The 100 to 500,000 on Steam was 23%. And again, you look at we have the categories a little bigger, but if you do the 100 to 500,000 on ours, you'll see that it's 12 plus the 27, so it's about 40%. So the numbers are obviously a bit higher, but again, we go into the majority of these games on Steam are pretty inexpensive, and they're done by a lot of startup developers. The other thing that throws us off is the 3 million plus at the 0.87%. But again, keep in mind that that's out of almost 30,000 games. That's 1%. So it's still 300 games that are 3 to 10 million or more. So anyway, again, use this data as more informative and anecdotal. Don't use it as rocket science, but as somebody who really likes to look at things with data before I make decisions, it's just important to know what you're competing with and where when you're planning out your game and your budget.
I have a question concerning monetization.
Sure. I'll go back to that slide. There we go.
With the EU looking at changing their stance on loot boxes and how did the one executive put it? Surprise mechanics.
Yes.
You are familiar with what I'm talking about.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. The
yes.
uproar, especially about a year ago. Yes.
Yes. How are investors looking at that now? Because there has been discussions about it going through Congress, identifying those items as gambling along with the EU. Are investors more concerned about that, or are they kind of shying away from it?
I think they're just looking for develop. So again, this goes back to when I talk to when I give kind of my general talk to developers. I always, and I'll get this a little bit later. So thanks for asking this. You set me up well. That investors and publishers are actually interested in developers that can run a business, not just build a game. So when you're putting your pitch together, part of that is proving to me that you know how to run a business, because, and Larry will understand this. I can't tell you how many deals I've done with developers who get 3/4 of the way, 80% of the way through the game, and they miscalculated either the time they need or the budget they need, and they come back needing more money. Or what's even worse is they get the game to ship, they get that milestone payment, and then they go out of business because they can't keep the lights on because no more money's coming in for 3 to 6 months or more. So a big piece of things, and one of the things that's fundamentally shifted and which is actually good, is that a lot of these investors, and especially the mid-sized publishers, want developers to be sophisticated enough to run a business, because we're not building Scud missiles anymore. I'm not building a game that ships to retail and being done with it and moving on to the next and hoping it hits the target, right? These are much more like, for lack of a better analogy, cruise missiles. I need the developer behind the scenes steering it, trying to hit the target, especially if it didn't quite hit the target at first. So I cannot afford to have this developer manage themselves so poorly that they go out of business right after launch. So that being said, and to extrapolate, it also means that investors who are looking at folks that are doing free to play and planning to do kind of loot boxes or whatever, that they're up on these regulations and understand what they're going to have to do to modify their game potentially and their game mechanics to still make money, but to be compliant with some of the new rules and regulations coming. So if you are planning to put loot boxes in a game, you're going to have to explain how you're not going to be potentially in violation. So yes, investors will ask those questions. And if you don't have an answer, you're probably not going to get investment. This goes back to one of the first rules I'll go when pitching: know your audience, right? So when you know, and I'm not talking about just know your audience when it comes to the player, but know your audience and who you're pitching to, and the fact that these people are going to be pretty sophisticated when it comes to some of this stuff. Hopefully that answers the question.
It does too, for 99% of it. Another follow-up or a follow-up that I have with that one is, how concerned are investors? Because if that does change, that could go and change the game's rating, the PEGI, or any of the other, yes, or any of the other organizations out there that go and rate these games. Like Australia is extremely conscious about certain aspects of games when it comes to violence and nudity.
Germany and I've had to deal with that. So I was in the industry when Night Trap came out back in the 90s, and for those who don't remember, that was the game that you literally had 5 or 6 Congress people sitting in front of this sitting in front of a joint session of Congress, waving the game about how bad the game industry and violent and how they needed to clamp down, and lawsuits and regulations. So yeah, this kind of things and government jumping into games is nothing new. The thing about that's great about games is technology wise, we're usually 2 to 5 years ahead of most other industries, but we're 10 years ahead of usually most governments and regulations and regulatory bodies. So because of that, there's always going to be a tail that comes up, and all it takes is one, disgruntled parent with a friend that's in Congress or in the government to make all this happen. So I think investors are wary. Again, they're not investing. They're investing. If they're investing in games moving forward, they're wary. If the games are already out, there's not much they can do about it, right? They want a plan. They want developers to understand the business and the business they're going into and how they're going to address these potential problems. Now, here's the great thing: is if I find a game that has a solution for this that's not going to dramatically decrease my revenues, but solves this problem, they're probably going to get a whole bunch of money thrown at them because they've now solved the problem that most people didn't know existed a year ago. And that is another great way to get money, if you can solve a problem for people before they know it's a problem. So yes, investors are going to be wary. Again, they can't do much about the games that are already out, except expect if the developers are sophisticated enough to start putting contingency plans in place. But for developers pitching now, and if loot boxes are a core mechanic of that game and the revenue, they better start thinking about how to come up with something else, because they could risk not getting any investment because people will be wary. So that was a great question. So thank you.
No, thank you.
All right, so let's go back. So I'm going to talk about some keys to success when you're pitching. And I'm going to call this the not so secret keys to success, because there's really no secrets here. The one thing I love about this industry is people are generally pretty open, but there really aren't a lot of secrets in our business. When pitching and selling your game, you need to and not find an automated taco machine. Although if you do have one, let me know, because I'll give you some money right now. I kill for a good taco, since I can't go to any of my favorite taco shops. When pitching, you're selling your game, you need to get people's attention. And when I say attention, that's from press, influencers, investors, publishers. And the reason you need to get their attention is that you then need to get their time. If folks won't give you their time, and I'm talking, you can't get their time to an investor, you may get their attention, but if you can't keep their time, you're never going to get their money. Right? So you have to get their attention long enough to get their time. And then you have to get me to pay attention long enough and give you enough of my time to figure out if I'm going to give you my money. And the best way to do that is to find a way to make it look like I'm an idiot if I don't invest in your game. Make this look like such a sure thing that somehow if I pass on this game and it goes on to be a huge success, my boss is probably going to fire my ass for being too stupid to bring it in. And I will say this: most biz dev people or dev relations or whatever you want to call it, or the folks at investors that are looking at these games really do love the industry. They love developers. They love games. They're under a lot of stress and a lot of pressure. And it's really hard to make a decision when you go through an event and you see 60 pitches in 3 days. So one of the reasons for the long maybe instead of the quick no or yes is oftentimes I don't want to be the person that said no to the next Rocket League. But when I say yes, there's a whole team of other people that also have to say yes. So I'm spreading the risk around. By the time we sign a game, when I was at 505, 7 or 8 people all had to say yes before that game got signed. So even if I was the one who brought the game in, if it failed, there was plenty of blame to go around. Now, if I kept bringing in failures, sure, my job could be at risk. Or if I kept bringing in really crappy games, my job could be at risk. But if I was bringing in games that looked good or had potential, then they would always get looked at. But the decision by committee takes forever. And most of these investors and especially publishers generally have a committee involved in making these decisions, which is why it's always the long maybe and very seldom is it a quick no or yes. If it's a quick no, it just means it's not a fit or it's just really bad. And if it's a quick yes, you're amazing and congratulations. But that's why it's the long maybe, and it explains a lot. But this also goes back to why I say attention, time, and money. And that's the order. It's the order with press. It's the order with influencers. It's the order with investors, and it's the order with consumer. And you know, I joke about this slide a lot, but it literally, the number of developers that don't understand the importance of getting my attention, keeping my time before they can get my money is a little bit amazing to me. All right, so I put this next set of slides in here because I don't want anybody to have to ask at the end, because we talked a bit about Funding Club and all this great stuff we're doing. And the elephant in the room, of course, is why is Xsolla doing it? Why are we spending the money and the resources? Why are we having somebody who's been in the industry for 25 plus years help run this? And here's why. What's in it for Xsolla? Generate goodwill with developers and investors. We are in a unique, interesting position because we position ourselves as a business engine. We are kind of a white label solution, but we're on the front lines with consumers. And we are also the first to take blame with developers when something goes wrong because we're handling the money. So one of our ways to combat that with developers and with investors is to provide something of significant value without upfront costs or any cost, frankly. Next reason we do it is actually give developers an opportunity to learn and explore all of Xsolla's offerings with no obligations and no stress. And then the last thing is, and this is where we all truly believe, is that we believe great games can emerge from anywhere. And our CEO has drilled this into everybody at the company's head, that you never know where the next great game is going to come from. So the more developers that can get their ideas seen by investors, the more likelihood the next set of great original cool games are going to be able to get the money they need to get funded. And I use Untitled Goose because I joke about this. When I first built this page in particular, Untitled Goose Game had been out for about 2 or 3 months. And I was talking to a bunch of friends and I literally said, who would have thought, 5 years ago, 2 years ago, even a year ago, we'd all be sitting around this table, having a drink, eating dinner, and talking about an asshole goose in a game. And that really kind of illustrates the fact is, did anybody predict this kind of game would come out and have the success it would? No. And I think the traditional method for this game getting pitched and getting funded probably wouldn't have worked. So we really believe that we're hoping we can help the next Untitled Goose Game get found. And if we don't, great. But if we do, even better. So let's go into really what's in it, because everybody's still probably going, you're not that altruistic. And the reality is we aren't, but we are. Benefits to developers. Project-based financing in most cases. And again, the investors and publishers negotiate their own deals, but in most cases, these are project-based deals, so it's project-based financing. So developers don't generally have to give up a lot of equity or give up their company in order to get the games made. They're co-investment opportunities because it's actually classified as an investment club. Investors are allowed to pool resources. So more than one investor can decide to co-invest in a game, and there's nothing prohibiting it. Now, I will say that doesn't happen very often, but it can happen because the way the club is set up, because people get all the matches at the same time. So none of the investors have advantages over the other. So if you have several investors that are interested in a project and they're all contacting the developer, and several of them are saying we're interested, but we can't quite afford the whole thing, the developers can then pool the investors can pool their money if they show desire. And there's a case where there's actually 2 investors talking about that with one of the games right now. Practical resources, things like us giving these talks, but we're working on a pitch template deck. And again, it's not a sample pitch. It's really a template of all the things you need to think about that should be in your deck to make it complete. We're putting together a list of grants and money that's out there that people may not know about. I'm in the middle of writing an article about what it takes to pitch, and we have a bunch more content coming down the line. And then it's free, right? So the big 4-letter F word for everybody, it's free. We don't charge developers at all. We don't charge them up front. We don't charge them on the back end. There is no cost to participate. On to investors. Benefits: access to relevant, high-quality project. I spent a little time on this earlier. They're generally only seeing games that fit within a spectrum of what they say they're interested in. They're not seeing a bunch of, if they're not looking at mobile, they're not seeing a bunch of mobile games. If they're only looking at PC, they're not seeing a bunch of console unless they've said they want to see console as well. If they're only investing in games that are $1 million plus, we're not sending them any games that are only 500,000. In other words, you think of this as a little bit like eHarmony for investors and developers. However, the developers don't get to see their matches. Only the investors do. There's an opportunity to share info and make deals. Again, Xsolla does not make investment recommendations, but we do share data that's publicly available, like the data I had in some of these slides from other resources like Newzoo, so they can make deals together if they so desire. They're saving resources. They don't have to travel as many trade shows. Other thing, a lot of these investors really only have 1 or 2 people actually looking at games. And we were talking to one of the folks from Kowloon a while ago, and they were mentioning they were literally on the road 40 to 50 weeks out of the year. So the problem is you just miss so much good content because you can't attend every show. So we're hoping to expose some games to investors and folks that they might not have seen before. And because there's no cost to the investors and developers, even if they've seen the game before, there is no risk to the developer of losing a deal because there might be a finder's fee now. There's no fees, so there's no risk. And we've actually even had an investor come back and say, I looked at this game 6 months ago, but I didn't pay attention to it. But when you resent it, I realized that I should pay more attention to it, and they contacted the developer. So it's actually a chance to resurface some games potentially as well. And the last part, of course, it's free, right? So it's a really cool thing. Now, ultimately, what's really in it for Xsolla is we're hoping that developers have a really good experience with Xsolla, and we're hoping the investors and publishers also had a good experience with Xsolla, and those that want to self-publish will use our tools and services. There is no requirement to do so, because we don't want to force people into something and then have them not participate because they can't get money. So they don't have to use us, but we're hoping the experience is so good they will. So now we'll talk about my crystal ball a little bit here. And again, I don't think any of these are too big of a reach or too difficult to pull. So I'm not putting myself on a limb, but here we go. The good. So what's good right now? Game revenue, game play time, game viewing, all way up. Digital sales are completely dominating. So that means margins in general for people in our industry, developers, and everybody else in the pipeline and food chains are higher because there is no retail or very little retail, although retail is still a big piece. So don't abandon retail if you have an opportunity. So that's really good. We're lucky to be in the industry we're in. I'm probably have 5 conversations a day where I'm thankful that we're in games. The good, and this, I find this is a funny good, so this is meant a little sarcastically. The World Health Organization endorses gaming, and it's become even more socially acceptable. And of course, this is 6 to 8 months after they basically labeled addictive gaming disorder as a disorder, which was hotly contested by most clinicians. So it's pretty interesting to see their reversal on this, given what's going on right now. But because of that, games are more socially acceptable. So we're seeing people who wouldn't have played games before all of a sudden feel that it's safe to and okay to play games. So I think that will carry on as a halo effect for our industry for when things do settle down. We might see a small dip because everybody's so happy to be able to go out, but people who become gamers generally don't stop gaming. So the bad, what's going on right now. World economy in a global recession. And I don't want to, rain on everybody's parade, but we all know it's going to get worse. It's not getting better, and at least not anytime soon. That will eventually affect our industry. To what extent, we don't know, and to how much, we don't know. And there's some ways that I'll talk about in a minute, but that's not good news for anybody. Deals not already in progress are going to take much longer to close. People with money get tight when they don't know what's going on and they can't predict the future. So we get into the ugly. Due diligence was hard before. It's extremely difficult, if not impossible now. It's really hard to build trust virtually. No matter how many times I meet somebody in Zoom or Skype or Google Hangouts or Microsoft's whatever, it's really hard to build a really good trusting relationship virtually. The best way to do that for me is always to sit with the developer in person or at their studio, get to know them, get to know the team, understand what it is I'm investing. Those deals will happen. They're just going to take a lot longer and be much slower. Game delays, submissions taking longer. So we all know the story because it's been pretty public about The Last of Us being delayed indefinitely. I can say this because this is the IGDA and most people will chuckle. We knew they were in huge trouble long before this pandemic hit. They lost, 10 of the top 12 leads at the company because of other stuff going on. So this just became a great excuse to delay the game indefinitely. However, I think before all the big AAA stuff ships this fall, you're going to see more games slip and get delayed. I think it's much harder for really big teams to function remotely than it is teams 2 to 20 or 40. Teams of 200 or 300 people, having all those people function properly remotely is really difficult. And the other piece that a lot of people aren't talking about, submissions are going to take longer because first parties can't have their lot checks and QA people on a room talking to each other. I know companies are even finding trouble finding third-party vendors for QA localization and ratings because they can't have all their people working on projects in a room. And there's a lot of security issues around static IP addresses and locking down of code and all of that. So we're a little far behind and we were caught a little unprepared there. We will catch up quicker than most industries, but that is taking significantly longer and it will continue to take longer and longer. And that's pretty ugly because I think you're going to see a lot of games that you thought were going to be on time get delayed. Games that are pretty far along, maybe not, but games that are still post alpha and pre beta, especially the bigger games, are going to struggle to get out on time. And then lastly, and yes, this is possible, investors are even more risk averse. When investors can't use their best guess and make predictions, they get tighter with their money. And money is getting tight. So deals that were in progress are getting done, if not rushed to get done, because people don't want to lose them. But starting deals, I know a lot of investors are basically saying, I'm going to look, but I'm not going to put my toe in the water for 3 to 6 months at least. So things are going to get tighter until we figure out what's going on. That said, anytime things go wrong, there are opportunities. So money still needs somewhere to go. So there's a lot of folks sitting on a lot of cash and they still need to. And when I say need to invest it, I mean it. Most funds have rules and regulations that go about deploying their capital. And they cannot sit on the money they have allocated for investments for too long without incurring risk as well as paying interest. So at some point, they're going to be forced to make investments. And so that money will find places to go. The term is content desert. So right now things are going to dry up and you're going to see 3 to 6 months of not as many deals getting done. But what does that mean? And that means in 18 months to 2 years from now, there's not going to be as much content. So the term that most investors are using is content desert. That means there's going to be a lot of holes in people's calendars and slates and a lot of release windows for content. So some good content that might have gotten lost in the froth of AAA and all the big releases might find new inroads and avenues to explore, especially with the new consoles coming out because there is less competition. There are more opportunities for games in other mediums. We've seen this with Netflix, Amazon, Hulu. A lot of places are now looking for games as sources of content because one of the pieces of content that can still be made for these channels is animation. Because animation can be done remotely really effectively and really well. And it's really tough for these people to just build original content. So you are going to see more game related stuff coming out in linear content moving forward. There's a number of deals that are happening I can't talk about, but that are happening, and you're going to see more stuff in the next 18 months on some of these channels and some of these distribution platforms. And when that happens, that means there's more opportunities for merchandising and other ancillary revenue for our industry. So there stuff that never really happened before in our industry or lagged is going to start happening because of this. The other things that always happen when things get tough, as we saw in 2008, 2009 with the economy, is new business models emerged. Back then, it was free to play. Microtransactions, which were pretty much loathed in the West, became acceptable because of the economy. So things that have been okay but not going great are going to become vastly more endorsed. Xbox Game Pass, Apple Arcade. I put Stadia question mark because you have to assume Stadia is going to survive, and Google's not going to cut it in the next couple of years for that to happen. But I think you're going to see the rise of these models as people start tightening the belts financially. They're going to still be looking for content and ways to get exposed to a lot of content without continually having to pay for it. And subscription models, I'm still not a big fan of a lot of these because they can screw the content creators if you're not careful. But you are going to see some people actually win because of those. Subscriptions for individual games, developers, publishers, season passes, etc. We've been seeing this at Xsolla for about 2 years, the increase, and you're seeing more and more of it. Obviously, Fortnite has been huge with their season passes, and so have a bunch of other games. I think you're going to see more and more of this, especially from the bigger games. Talented teams that know how to finish are still going to be in high demand. And I say this, teams with experience that know how to deliver a product on time and on budget will continue to be in demand, if not even more so, because of the content desert I mentioned. When you have trouble doing due diligence on new studios, you're going to try to go with studios that are existing or have at least shipped titles and know what they're doing to minimize your risk. So teams with experience that know how to finish will find themselves more opportunities because investors are going to be a little more hesitant for brand new startup studios unless they've really got a really good demo. So this goes back. You really need to have something amazing if you're new. New emerging markets will pop up. I think we already talked about it, but I think you're going to see opportunities in markets where they're not being completely dominated by COVID. Vietnam has opened back up. A lot of Southeast Asia has done pretty well. And I think those markets have been interesting for a while, but I actually think those could see some acceleration in growth because those markets their economies aren't being hurt as bad. And India is another place where I think will be a new market that's going to grow pretty rapidly for games. Pricing is always a problem, but there's a huge burgeoning middle class in India. And because of that, I think game revenues in India will grow significantly over the coming years. So we talked about opportunities here. I'm going to talk about some upcoming digital events that you may or may not know about. Most of these are public available all over the place. I just try to put them all in one place, and I'll go through it quickly. Nordic Online, GameIndustry.biz Investment Summit Online, Pocket Gamer Digital, Brazilian Independent Game Festival. That's actually one of my favorite shows, by the way, for looking for new up-and-coming cool talent. Indigo X, White Knights, DevGam, DevCom, and Meet to Match Cologne Edition, and Gamescom just announced what they're planning to do for their digital stuff. So these are just, a handful, I think 9 of the bigger events that are public, that are out there, that developers are able to go to and pitch, that have investors and publishers lined up. So if you're not aware of these, you are now, hopefully. And again, this isn't rocket science. They're out there, but I wanted to try to put as many as I could in one place. These are all shows that Xsolla normally goes to and exhibits at, but because we can't exhibit, we still are putting the list together for folks to know about, because we're hoping that some developers can actually still get their stuff seen. I attended a show last week, which is a European Games Biz Dev conference that was actually pretty successful. Saw some good pitches, and there was a good number of investors. So you can still find these folks. Yes, it is harder to pitch online sometimes, but you can still get in front of a lot of really interesting folks to pitch your games. So now questions. Actually, quickly, before I get to the questions, I'll say thank you. This is a joke because I'm the old man at my company, and people tease me about being old. My nickname has become Dark Yoda at the company because I'm old, wise, and a bit of a smartass. and I am bald and short, and hopefully I'm not green most of the time. There's my Twitter handle, my LinkedIn. If anybody wants to connect on LinkedIn, feel free to reach out to me. Just let me know that this is why you're reaching out, so I have context, and I don't just go, you're some random person trying to sell me something. I'm going to escape out of this and stop presenting, if I can figure out where to do that here. Turn off presenting, stop presenting. Okay, so hopefully I didn't bore everybody too much, and there was some good information. And happy to take questions. If there are no questions, I'm happy to go drink a beer.
But before you go drink a beer, let me just tell you that the thing that jumped out to me is I've been doing, as you know, I've been doing pitches for a while. It was not until maybe 2 years ago that I learned the importance of putting in how much money you had invested in the game in your pitch deck. I always felt that, you know, if I'm asking you for money, I don't have to tell you how much I've invested. And as soon as I was asked that by somebody, I hearkened back to the words of my old mentor who said, show that you've got some skin in the game.
Yep. You de-risk it. And I cannot emphasize this enough. I would say a good 60 to 70% of the pitches I see initially don't mention what the developers put into it. And I get it if it's just on paper and, you know, it's two guys sitting in a room who come up with a concept. I get that it's hard to put a real figure. And I'm also going to caution you, don't overestimate what you put into it and make it ridiculous and pay yourselves each, you know, $200,000 a year salaries as a startup, right? Because you're going to scare folks off because they're going to be like, that's too expensive. But think about what you would be paying yourself a realistic wage if your studio was being funded, or if you're funding yourself. And you need to give yourself credit for that, because if you don't, God knows the investor's not going to. Not only will it help you get a deal because the investor knows you have skin in the game, it's going to help you get a better back end or revenue share because you've de-risked the project significantly. So it's super important. Now, again, don't overestimate that amount and just make up some fuzzy number, because I guarantee you that when I dig in, I'm going to ask you about it if I think it's bullshit. That is something that will make me cause bullshit. And it's not necessarily a red flag unless it's ridiculous. But there are a lot of little yellow flags in a pitch. And that is a yellow flag. If I think you're fudging your number and making it too high to make it look like you have more skin in the game, that's going to make me wonder if you know how to run a business or actually calculate real cost accurately, which is going to make me cause your whole budget into question. So super important that you're fair and reasonable, but accurate, and you can back it up.
Dustin, why don't you go ahead and ask your question? It's a great question you've posed in channel, but go ahead and ask it.
All right, sorry about that.
No, it's okay.
Yeah. So going back to the slide where you basically mentioned that 78 have actually been 78 submissions have been actually moved forward, right? Versus
Yes.
the 322 that are actually submitted. So
Correct.
my question was, how much give and take was there between you and the developers before you finally decided, you know what, we got to cut these guys loose, or actually we need to move them on?
Well, so generally it's interesting, and that's actually a really good question. So I would say the 24%, most of those nail the pitch the first time, right? They know what they're doing. They know how to pitch. There's not a lot of back and forth. So I would say a good 75% of that 24. So say 50 of the 78, maybe 60 of the 78 actually gave us good pitches, and they were approved the first time around. The other ones, again, there's nothing that says you can't resubmit. And a lot of times we will go back to developers, especially with incomplete applications, and say, hey, you're missing this, or this wasn't clear. And we're trying to work on a better way to provide feedback to the developers without ending up in a long cycle of arguing or haggling or in negotiations about, well, you should submit my game because I know what I'm doing. It's a fine line, because the amount of bandwidth that can take up really quickly can be really difficult. But we generally get back to developers either with a match not found, or you're rejected, or some piece of feedback. And we never ban anybody from resubmitting unless we find it's a ripoff or a copycat, or somebody's stolen somebody else's stuff. So everybody's always welcome to resubmit. Most cases that are being turned down too is sometimes it's just too early. The pitch just isn't good enough. There's not enough information in there. There's not enough of a concept. And one of the things I say, well, here's another huge yellow flag or red flag, and this is flagged a lot, is I want the developer to tell me who their audience is. And when I say like, who is your audience, and not just demographically, the typical 18 to 34-year-old male, but who your audience is, what are they currently playing? Like, what is the person that you think is the audience for this game currently playing, and then tell me why you think they're going to stop playing that to play this game. Because I'll tell you what, I may be able to tell you a lot of numbers, but if you can't tell me who you're targeting, I sure as hell can't help you reach them. And that is your job to tell me who the game is for, not my job. So one of the big flags in a lot of these decks is that the developers haven't spent enough time doing their homework about who their audience is, what they're trying to build, what's unique about their game, and also doing realistic projections. So I'll go back to what I said. Great, if you're building a cool little RPG with a 10-person studio, you can say your inspiration was Zelda or Final Fantasy. That's fantastic. Those are two of my favorite games in history. But if you start putting your comps for sales as those two games, I'm not going to take you seriously, because you obviously don't know what you're doing from a business standpoint. So there's just some things that, and again, there's no school for learning to pitch. Larry, you've been doing this for a long time. How long did it take you to learn some of these things? You mentioned you just figured out a couple of them a couple of years ago, right?
I'm still in process.
Well, and that's the other thing. I think that as developers, we're excited about working on our games and pitching our games. One is you have to find a way to communicate your vision clearly and concisely, because I'm not in your head. And immediately by you creating the game, you know more about it than I ever will. So if I can't get that vision, but you also need to communicate the business side of that vision and show me how I can make money. And if you can't do that, you're going to have trouble selling the game in the first place.
I also get pitches sent to me, not anywhere near the quantity that you do. And the single biggest thing that people leave out when they show me a game is what made them excited to work on it.
Yep. And it's huge. And I will say, so, and this is also say that we do get a lot of games that are just too early. They're looking for that, angel the angel seed, whatever. And those out there know this. There's very few angel investors in our industry, and there's very few seed investors in our industry. And you're competing with so many people that are able to get a game to a really solid playable stage, that if you can't get your game there, it's going to be really hard to get money. And there's very few developers that can communicate their vision without something playable. In my career, I think I've signed 3 or 4 games in my 18 plus years looking at games that were just pitches. One that I can cite really well, because it's ingrained in my head, is a game called Abzu. For those of you who don't know it, it was done by Giant Squid and Matt Nava. Those who don't know who Matt Nava is, he was the lead artist and one of the key instrumental people on Journey and Flower. When I saw that pitch, it was in a hotel room called the Cover Hotel during Indiecade. He basically had some visuals, and those visuals were just mood pieces and a mood video set to music that basically showed you the emotional roller coaster that he expected players to go through as they played the game. It started out light, then went really dark, almost pitch black, and then to light. And then he explained it. You could literally close your eyes and see the game that he was pitching. And it also didn't hurt that he said, well, this is basically everything I wanted to do in Journey, but it's underwater.
Right.
And so that's, so when I talk about being able to communicate your vision, I've met very few people that can come to me that early and that clearly, concisely communicate their vision and have me believe in it and buy it. So short of that and you being that talented, and there's a lot of people in this industry that are, you need to give me something that I can touch, taste, see, smell, and play with.
Any other questions, guys?
I think Dustin had a follow-up, I think. So
yeah, I'm back. Ironically, what you just said covered half of it, but I'll go ahead and follow through. Going back to your slide, what do most investors / publishers want? I was going to ask for clarification on the gameplay video, but you just you just nailed that one. But I will ask about the second element, where you talk about show me something I won't see in the build I play. So for that, I'm guessing that doesn't have to be actually true gameplay. That could be mock-up stuff just to sort of infer what's coming, correct?
Yeah, so I'll tell you, and I don't know if anybody in this group knows Callum Underwood, who does stuff for a bunch. He actually does Kowloon. He's over at Super Hot Presents. He does stuff for a bunch of other things, and he's a much younger, better looking, smarter version of me in some ways. And he always talks about this, that he does this thing where he basically on Twitter, he has people just send him GIFs of their games. Right. And he'll look at those GIFs, and the ones he really likes, he'll reach out to those developers to get more information. Right. And if you can convince me to get more information in a GIF, you've started down the path to the light side. So, I always say that get something that's going to get their attention. Yes, you're right. The other piece of the stuff that may not be in that build yet can be mock-ups or whatever else. But one of the things you have to assume, especially if the build is, 5, 10, 20 minutes, that I might not play through the whole thing. So one of the ways to get me to play through the whole thing is maybe show me something at the end that I won't see unless I play through all of it, or show me something cool that unless I went down this one path that I might have missed. Because if you can get me excited enough to go back and play the build again or share it with somebody else, again, you're much farther down the road to progress. So it really is, it's about the art of the tease in a lot of ways. Right, the game itself has to be compelling. I have to find the fun pretty quickly, but then you also have to get me to get the vision. And if I can see something really cool or unique in that gameplay video that makes me want to play, or makes me reach out and say, "Hey, I saw that in the video. Is that in this build? Or when will you have a build of that playable?" Right, you've got me communicating with you already, which is a long way down the road, because most of the time, if I'm not interested, you'll either get thanks but no thanks, or you won't hear anything back from a lot of folks. So if you can get that dialogue going, you've already scored some big points. And so that's what I mean. It's a little bit, like it really is, it's setting the stage to get people to open up and have a real conversation with you about what you're trying to make. And that's what a lot, especially this day and age, you're going to be sending a lot of pitches blind to contacts or people you spend 2 minutes with, casually at a virtual trade show, or you have a half an hour and you can't do the whole pitch. And the thing to keep in mind is no matter who you send this to, for them to be able to say they're interested, they generally have to share it with a bunch of people internally. And I always used to tell developers when they're pitching me at 505, I am happy to go fight your battles, but give me the good ammo. Right? I'm not going to stick my neck out and recommend a game to my team and my boss unless I feel like I can back it up. So the more good stuff you give me to back it up, the more likely I am to go fight that battle. And I'm hoping that helps.
Dustin, anything else? Well, we got a thank you from Dustin, so I'm going to think you covered that.
Yeah, that was great. I appreciate that. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Do we have any other questions?
I have a couple things.
Sure.
So I guess first thing is I fit into that like 60% 0 to 100,000 invested for release. So in the past I've been kind of unsure about when and how to approach investors, because I guess partly it feels like I guess like, so you were talking as well before about well, sorry, I've got a bunch of questions. So so I've been nervous oftentimes to approach investors because for us, even 4,000 to 5,000 would go a long ways in just being able to buy my team members equipment and get them out to trade shows and stuff like that.
So I'm going to give you this real quick, and then I'm going to let you continue. So here's one of the issues with those really low amounts. I would generally, as an investor, rather take a risk on a $400,000 or $500,000 game than 5 $100,000 games. And here's why. Because yes, my odds, if the game's, even if the game does 2 or 3x at $100,000, I make 2 or 300,000. If I do 1 or 2x at 500,000, I've doubled or tripled my money. And the amount of effort I have to put into signing a game and doing all the due diligence and all the paperwork and all the financial reporting is basically the same as it is for a $100,000, $500,000, or $1 million deal. But the economies of scale and the upside on that bigger game are significantly higher. So one of the things you really have to think about on your game is what is the market upside and opportunity, because that's what the investor is going to care about. They're not necessarily going to care about the super low amount. They're going to care about what's the upside. So if you can't show an investor that there's significant upside, just the legal cost alone in signing a contract with you to send you $5,000 is going to cost me $10,000 or $15,000. So that, I get that you want to be super efficient and super frugal, and that's great. But you run into the problem with investors, unless you're going out and getting friends and family, or you find like an angel or something else, you may be better off looking at grants or some other things, because it's the return on investment is so difficult, but my costs stay the same. So when I was at Activision, to give you an idea, even though I was doing the licensing out, my last couple of years there, I couldn't touch a deal that didn't guarantee us at least $50,000 in revenue. And that was because I got assigned a cost of every deal of $25,000 just for internal time and bandwidth, including our legal costs. So on a legal contract, even if it goes really well, at a minimum, if I'm an investor, I'm spending $5,000 to $10,000 internally. Okay. So hopefully that kind of addresses. I know it's not a great answer for what you're trying to do. I have a lot of respect for what you're trying to do, but it's really difficult to approach most investors with an amount that low.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the unfortunate answer, but it's the truth, and that's good to know.
This is why I get called Dark Yoda. I give a lot of truth, although sometimes it's not the nicest, and so I'm not evil like Sith, but I can be pretty brutally honest. And if you think about Yoda and most of these interactions, he was kind of a jerk, but because Luke deserved it. So, and like I said, what I think you may be better off doing is kind of figuring out all of your costs. What all your costs would be to pay everybody some small salary for all the work they've already done on the game and everything they would need to do to finish the game, what it would cost to get all the equipment you need, so figure out all those costs combined, and maybe that gives you a number that's a little bit more than you're comfortable with, but it's going to be probably, believe it or not, if they believe in your project, more palatable to an investor.
Another way to approach that is to find games that are comparable to what you're looking to do, and get a sense of what their development costs were. So if you're looking to make a game that's just like a game that costs $200,000, that number will have a certain amount of reasonableness to investors.
Correct. So yeah, and again, the great thing I love about this community, if you see a game you really like and that's kind of inspirational, contact the developers. More often than not, those developers are going to be super friendly and super open about giving you some information. And that's one of the reasons why I like to do these talks, and I spend all that time on the IGDA board and the Global Game Jam board, is when I do these kind of talks, it reminds me of all the stuff that I forgot that I knew, but it also teaches me a lot, and it allows me to look at things from a different perspective, especially when I get these questions, because I go, okay, maybe I didn't do a good job of explaining that, or maybe, and the question you asked, that is something that I didn't cover that maybe I should have. And that is that asking for too little is sometimes a bigger problem than asking for too much.
Dr. Gore, do you have another question on there?
I do. So not as relevant now that I know that, but I guess so you were talking as well about the investors want to know and see how much you've invested. Is that always monetary, or can that also be time and any other resource?
So here's a saying that's about as cliche as you get. Time is money, right? So you've got to, again, if you're not giving yourself credit for the time you put into the game, nobody else will. So you need to find a way to attach a reasonable monetary value to the time that you or anybody else on your team has put into the game. And again, based on where you live, don't say that you're being paid a San Francisco salary at $15,000 a month when you live in Timbuktu, and it's really $2,000 or $3,000 is a livable wage. But consider what it would take if you were paying yourself to build this project, a Not exorbitant fee, because we know investors and we know founders generally take very little money up front. But figure out what it would, if you were paying your staff even a reasonable stipend to work on the game, how much would you be paying them over X period of time? And that is what you've actually invested in the game. It really is, because, and this is more, being an economist is dangerous, right? I think about everything as opportunity cost. And this is maybe why I make the point about investing too little has cost me more than investing too much. Right? There's an opportunity cost to everything you do. And the opportunity cost for you is, what kind of money could have you been making if you were working for another developer or a publisher doing what you currently do, and how much might have you been paid? Right? And that is the opportunity cost. And by the way, that's a cost that most artists pay. And that's why it's, being an artist involves a whole lot of sacrifice, right? Is that you're generally sacrificing pay to create your art. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't get credit for the pay that you might have gotten for building the project. So hopefully that makes sense. But spend some time in a spreadsheet paying yourself a reasonable amount. And if you work part-time and it was 20 hours a week, then fine. Take what you'd pay yourself for a full salary and divide it in half. But do that for everybody on the team, for how long they've worked on the project. And you will come up with a number that's probably quite a bit higher than you expected of how much you've actually invested already in the project.
And don't do that spreadsheet on just a one-time basis. Maintain that.
Yep.
I mean, maintain that so that the next time it comes up, you have that answer right at hand.
And so, and Larry knows this term really well, man month, right? So what does it cost per person per month? And you have a running total. And some people are like, a lot of times in a really good pitch, I'll actually have that in there. When somebody, they have 8 people on staff, they'll list them, designer, artist, programmer, and they don't have all of them paid all the time, because not of them are all on the project. But they'll have, I need an artist for 12 months on this 18-month project. I need a designer for 16 of the 18 months. And they'll literally have that broken down by how much they're paying them. And of course, that usually has overhead and margin, but they will have that broken down. So I can look at this spreadsheet and build out what the total budget is going to be individually and total, so I can see where all the money is going. That is a really good way to make me know that you know what you're doing, because then I can easily predict, okay, you do know exactly how much this is going to cost. And by the way, here's another yellow flag. Don't pitch me a perfectly round number. If you come to me with a budget that's exactly 500,000, it's exactly $1 million. In the back of my head, I'm going to be scratching and going, I've never seen a perfectly round budget for anything in my life. So I know that you fudged your numbers somewhere, and I generally know you fudged your numbers up, and it starts making me question your budget. So unless your numbers truly are perfectly round and you can back it up with that man month and costs, don't make them perfectly round.
Just to amplify what you're saying there, just having those numbers at hand and showing that you've been thinking about developing your game that way, that gives so much more of a feeling of confidence that you get what we're doing here.
Yeah, because I found that people that don't know what they put in the game have a tough time figuring out what they still need to finish the game. And when I mentioned investors hate uncertainty, we hate is probably too mild of a word. If we can't predict what it's going to cost to ship this game on time and on budget, it makes it really hard for us to want to commit money. And so the more confidence I have in the budget you're presenting is what it's actually going to cost me, the more so I've seen some really good pitches and some games that I was super interested in that I've walked away from because I did not believe those budgets were correct or true, or that I didn't believe the developer was going to come back with their hand out well into the project saying we need this much more money or we're going to go out of business. And I say this knowing that people might not like this. So here's another Dark Yoda moment. As much as developers like to bitch about being screwed over by publishers, and that's absolutely true, as somebody who's been a publisher and investor, I've been screwed over a hell of a lot more by developers than I've ever seen my folks that I'm working for screw over developers. And that is because they do a really poor job with time management and budget management. And they come back, and especially smaller developers will come back and say they'll miss a milestone or they'll miss 2 milestones in a row, and they don't communicate well. So I don't know until I get the milestone that they're failing. And they come back after we reject that milestone and say, well, if you don't approve it, we're going to go out of business. And to me, that's basically development blackmail. And I've had that happen more than a dozen times in the last 10 years. And so when I talk about, sure, yes, publishers have screwed developers over, absolutely. I've personally experienced that more than a dozen times the other way around, where I've basically been blackmailed into either having to cut a project and lose everything or overfund it because the developer did a really poor job. So most investors are sophisticated enough now to really dig in. And so when I talk about due diligence, they're really going to dig into whether or not they believe that the budget you're giving them is what it's going to take to ship this game, and you're able to do it for that amount. So spend a lot of time, figuring that kind of stuff out. There's, again, there's a lot of resources out there. You can search for this stuff, man months, sample budgets, all that stuff. And you can see how some other developers have been really forthcoming with a lot of that stuff. I know Yacht Club is always forthcoming about their sales numbers. So there's a lot of data you can get out there if you know where to look that will really help you with this stuff. And obviously participating in stuff like this can be super helpful. Larry's got a ton of resources and he knows everybody as well. So he can probably send it even more people than I can.
Any other questions? Yep. Go ahead.
Last question is, are the slides themselves going to be available or just the recording?
Well, if the recording, I don't know if it shows the slides. I don't know. I have to ask. Go ahead, Larry.
So the recording will show the slides, but Justin, if you want to make your presentation available, we'll host it also.
Yeah, let me check with the team.
Sure.
And I know obviously we're okay sharing these numbers. I just don't know how much we want these slides passed around without somebody like one of us being able to speak to them. Which is why I don't mind this coupled with the talk. But some of these slides as standalones can be taken really out of context. And I don't want to be answering questions at some conference with somebody super pissed off about something I said or something I wrote in this deck that really upset them, which is why I'm careful not to name too many names. But so that let me just check with the team if they're comfortable with the deck being sent out by itself separately.
If we're at the end of questions, I have one statement just again to amplify something that I think is gold that Justin said. Do not take the statement about time being money lightly. It really is. And let me give you some consequences. So first of all, you need to figure out how long it's going to take to make a game and be realistic about that in your projections. That drastically impacts your funding needs and the costs for the game. That's one thing. But if you don't have those things and you're working with a publisher, well, the publisher can't spin up any marketing for you because they can't spin up marketing because they don't know when the game will be finished. They can't align your game with the other games in their portfolio. I mean, I could go down the list of things that you can't do unless you have that date. Once you have that date, then you fall into the other part of the game developer / publisher nightmare, which is when you're 48 hours away from the date that you've committed to ship the game and you're 700 hours away from finishing the game, and that's when you get into crunch time. The whole industry will talk about crunch and the evils of crunch, and it is. Crunch comes about because managers, directors make mistakes in computing how long something's going to take. It's not done with malice aforethought. It's not we're at the top of the pyramid and we're thinking, how can we make these developers' lives living hells? That's not what it's about. You've been at those meetings too, Justin.
Let's also be clear. Sometimes it is mismanagement on the publisher's part or somebody in senior management's part as well. So, but yes, yeah. Absolutely.
but usually it's usually due to a mistake of how long something is gonna take.
Sometimes it's just tradition at that company.
Yeah, yes, that's true. So there's the 80-20 rule that's out there, right? And I say this, it goes for development, that 80% of the work is in the last 20% of shipping a game.
Yeah.
Because that's when everything has to work and play together and the bills have to, and this is why I say a lot of investors are hesitant to invest in people that haven't shipped something. Even if that game, the first thing they shipped, the first couple of games they shipped weren't wildly successful financially, just knowing that somebody knows how to finish a project, gives me a lot more confidence, especially right now when I can't sit with them and get the sense of the person and belief. So it's super important that you spend a lot of time really understanding what it takes to finish. And by the way, there's other things, there's other repercussions of being late that Larry didn't go into, although I'm sure he could, is if you're late and the game's going to console, you miss your windows, you miss your slots for QA, you miss your slots for release, and it starts costing a lot of time and money. And it gets really bad really quickly for the investor or publisher.
So I'm glad that you mentioned QA, because that was going to be the next thing. When I prepare time schedules, one of the last items that I have on there is a period of time for QA. I do not assume that any game that's going to be produced by any team that I've ever worked with will go through QA and get 100% on the first pass. It's going to get passed back to the developers to fix something. We found a bug. Well, nobody puts a bug in intentionally, so now you go through the 5 stages of debugging. I always reference that stage 1 is it can't possibly happen, and stage 5 is how did this ever work. But it's true. I mean, it's true. We've gone through some pretty lengthy QA stuff. Everybody knows we ship Doom 64 with Bethesda. I have the greatest respect, absolutely the greatest respect for the QA team over at Bethesda. 100% our development team wrote back to them saying, you guys made us better. But those are the kinds of things that newbie developers, first time, don't think about. Don't think about that when you sign off and say the game is ready, it probably isn't.
So here's the other thing and this is where I emphasize this. People joke and people blow this off. Relationships with your publisher or investor are like marriages, and treat them like that. The time and energy you put in at the beginning to build a really solid relationship pays off in spades later. This is game development. Shit goes wrong. Larry, have you ever worked on a game where something unforeseen didn't blow up or go wrong?
Nope. I've only been in this business 21 years, so yeah, no, I've yet to see that. Yep.
So this is where having that relationship with your publisher, your investor, communicating, being honest, upfront, and clear. Don't try to hide that you're running behind on something. Don't try to hide that you've got a bug that you can't solve. Tell your people as soon as possible, because generally that person on the other side is an advocate for you. They're your champion, and you want to empower them. The last thing you want to do is head into a green light meeting or head into a milestone meeting and embarrass them in front of their bosses, because that will ruin your project.
So ironically, the first conversation that I had this morning at not quite 8 a.m. Was with one of my developers, and they were talking about 2 issues that they thought they could solve but were blockers. But we had a meeting with a client 6 hours later, and I said, you need to write an email right now telling them about those issues. Feel free to say you're attempting to solve them on your own, but you need to say, I'm blocked because of these 2 issues. And you need to have that out there before the meeting starts. You don't tell people at the meeting. That stuff's got to be disclosed in advance. And just
don't leave your partner with their pants down in a meeting. When you burn those kind of bridges, it's hard to ever get their trust back. And if your producer, if it's at a publisher, it's usually a producer and an investor. You usually have a lead liaison. If they end up in a meeting with their pants down, your relationship is not going to get better.
Right.
That's when they start being overbearing. That's when they start checking in all the time. That's when they start visiting the studio and getting up in your business because you've proven untrustworthy. And the best way to keep these folks out of your day-to-day business is to be honest and communicate and be clear and be reasonable and fair. And I say this, and it sounds so trite, put yourself in other people's shoes. And I think people forget how hard that is to do sometimes. But when you're getting ready to pitch, put yourself in an investor's shoes. Look at your pitch objectively. Are they going to be able to understand what you're pitching? Is any of it going to make sense? And the same thing when you're working with a partner, you do get that investment. Am I going to end up putting this person at risk for losing their job because I screwed them? And if that's the case, you better let them know as soon as possible. I always say that people in this industry don't really leave. They just switch booths. So you got to be really careful about burning bridge, because I have run across people that, that I was actually at 505 with a producer and we were getting ready to sign a game. And he remembered that developer in a particular project that went south and we killed the game, even though we were literally weeks away from signing it because of his bad experience with that developer and the team.
Yeah.
This
Absolutely
stuff
true. And that's not to say, let me just be clear on that. That's not to say that you can't make mistakes, that you can't screw up. You just have to acknowledge that you made them and you have to be upfront about them.
Well, and stuff, like I said, it's just honestly, anybody who's been married for a long time, no shit goes wrong, right? And the only way through that is clear communication and honesty. And that's why I say you got to treat these relationships, because ultimately when I leave Xsolla or any company I've ever worked for, the only thing I take with me really are the relationships that I formed.
Yeah.
And so those you ask a developer, anybody else, your most valuable asset long-term in this industry is the relationships you build with your peers and other folks. So you really can't afford to mess those up.
Yeah.
And believe me, I've worked with partners and stuff goes wrong all the time. And I worked with a partner where, I was at Activision, we screwed them over. And I actually flew out to visit them to tell them we screwed them over in person and spent literally 3 or 4 hours in their office figuring out a way to work through it so they didn't get in trouble with their boss.
Really great presentation. So I've got the recording. I will get that over and we'll work on that. I'll let you know whether it will be available in a raw file or YouTube. We'll figure that out. This presentation was spot on. A lot of good points. I know that many people that don't have that much industry experience, you gave a fantastic grounding. I will tell you that I pulled away a couple of nuggets that I've reserved for future use.
That's I always hope that at least I try to say in any presentation like this, as long as anybody listening got at least one nugget out of one of the slides, then I'm happy.
It was really, really good. We're getting feedback. Amazing presentation. Thank you so much. Other comments was that there are probably only 4 dozen people that work in biz dev in the entire industry.
There might be a few more than that. There's maybe only 4 dozen that are any good.
we just keep switching seats all the time. So
yep, that's why I'm saying don't burn those bridges. Even if you get a no from somebody, take it in stride. Try to learn from it. See if they'll give you some feedback and move on, because you're going to run into that same person again.
All right. And again, thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.
Thank all the other team members over at Xsolla for making this possible also.
Yeah, they did most of the heavy lifting. Our design team who put together the deck, I basically spit out a bunch of ideas and they throw it all into something that makes sense. So
all right, thanks again. And
thanks, everybody.
When this is all over, I'm coming over to your place for dinner.
Hey, I'm happy to come out to Vegas and have a good meal too. So
there you go.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Cheers, everybody. Good night.